Well, it's been yet another busy news week. President Cyril Ramaphosa is due to depart for the United States this evening. This is ahead of a working visit. The NPA also announced this week that it will not prosecute the Cwecwe rape case. Another big story from the past 7 days, of course, being Pastor Timothy Omotosho today leaving the country. Well, to discuss this and other top stories of the week, I am joined in studio by Lorato Tshenkengg, social commentator. Lorato, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's hard not to want to start with the week that's coming, even though we want to look back. And I think let's give in to that impulse and say, all right, the president is off to the US. So many concerns around what that meeting certainly is going to look like. Just, you know, at face value, I ask you, what do you expect your biggest concerns?
So, Naledi, I think, you know, if the meeting with President Trump and Ukraine President Zelensky had not happened, I don't think we'd expect or would be, you know, this expectant, right? Because that meeting gave us, at least myself, gave me an insight into when President Trump does not think highly of you, he may actually treat you the way he treated President Zelensky, right? In the White House, with the media in place. And the question, therefore, is, considering how many times he has President Trump has repeated the lie about white genocide, even when he has been corrected, even when there's been a lot of information to confirm that there's none of that is happening in the country, he's not a fool. President Trump is not a person that does not know that there is no white genocide happening in South Africa. But this, you know, him perpetuating this narrative, and then for me, the question is, how is he going to treat President Cyril Ramaphosa when they're sitting across from one another?
And what do you think that's going to look like? I mean, are you expecting, I mean, you talk about the example of Ukraine President Zelensky, and that meeting was what some have described as a catastrophe, right? Do you think that that's what we'll see, those kind of explosions? And is there a way around that? Fortunately,
you know, President Cyril Ramaphosa has projected himself as a person of decorum, right? So the likelihood is that, you know, he's going to be a lot more measured. But also that dry run with President Zelensky, I think, gives anyone who's going to meet with President Trump to say, if you're temperamental, things can go, you know, it's a, you want us to go to the pigsty, let's go, right? So I suspect President Cyril Ramaphosa, with his, you know, measured temperament, he's likely to read the room a lot better, and he's likely to want to, you know, come across as a, we are not here to fight. This must be a win-win for both of us, for Pretoria and for New York, you know, for the US.
Yeah, I specifically remember after that meeting with Zelensky and US President Donald Trump, watching discussions taking place in our own National Assembly. No, it was actually in a portfolio committee, Songezo Zibi essentially saying that he's concerned about what it would look like if we send the president to the US. It certainly gets us to a point where we think about the strength that the president needs to portray, and if we're confident in that strength, right?
So I guess the advantage in our case was, so you remember when the ambassador to the US, you know, was considered a persona non grata in the US, the South Africans, you know, almost, or at least Pretoria, quickly just said, listen, you are a persona non grata, you must come back to the country. And when Ibrahim Rasool came to the country, the presidency even put out a, you know, a communique to try and say, when he arrives here, let us not do a song and dance about making him the hero. And it was a way of trying to then maintain, or at least, you know, project a message that says that while there may be things that are factual, one of them being that we have gone to the ICJ in The Hague to put a case against Israel. You may not like it as the US, but it's a fact. The fact as well is that the ICJ has now, you know, considered Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, to be, you know, or at least what Israel is now perpetuating against Palestine is a crime against humanity, right? And those, therefore, you know, to a great extent, there will always be anyone who is in the pro-Trump camp and who is likely to want us to, and us as in South Africa, to withdraw from that case. You know, they're likely to treat him as a nobody. And perhaps that's what the confidence that Songezo was referring to say that when you walk into a room when somebody does not think nothing of you, the likelihood is that you are always going to be in the back foot, and you have to be very calculative. In my view, I think the president is going to be that calculative. But is President Trump going to give him the kind of dignity that he deserves as a head of state of a sovereign country? May 21 will tell us.
There is also the argument that that the point's been made that President Donald Trump operates from a very transitionary point of view. It's, what can we barter? What can we agree on here? And there's, someone arguing, for instance, that President Cyril Ramaphosa, a businessman himself, may be able to speak his language. Is that something that we could use? That's the one thing. And I think to add to that, as we speak business, then there's the reports that we might very well see Elon Musk in that meeting as well.
Sure. And I was actually about to raise the Elon, or at least the calls from Pretoria to Washington, right? Remember, there was a call between Elon Musk and the president. How much of that did that yield, right? So it tells you what we need to know as South Africans, that I suspect in that call, the president had possibly spoken to Elon and said that we are concerned about the platform that you own being X, that it continues to put out a lot of negative narrative about South Africa. In fact, not just negative. It is incorrect. It is inaccurate. It is misinformation and disinformation. Have we seen any change ever since that meeting? Not, right? So I guess the biggest thing is really going to be, and you're quite correct, this meeting is going to be a meeting of optics. How should Elon Musk be in the room? How he's going to be, you remember during the meeting of Zelensky and President Trump, there was many moments where the Deputy President, J.D. Vance, chipped in a lot, right? So I guess it's that question. And again, President Trump almost just folding his arms saying, I want to see where this goes. Only intervened at a particular moment. So it's going to be interesting to see, one, whether, in fact, that meeting is going to be as televised as the Zelensky-Trump meeting was, which, for me, I think for the good of South Africans, I hope it's a private meeting. We only get a press statement that tells us what happened and transpired in that meeting. Because the optics may be so bad that the people who believe, or at least don't have confidence in President Ramaphosa, are even going to be saying, we knew it, right? And those that want to continue believing in this white genocide issue, may then want to even take the side. But what is going to be also very interesting is now that he's not going by himself, right? He's going with other ministers. For me, the curious choice was, it's an obvious choice, but it's a curious choice. John Steenhuisen as one of the delegates. John Steenhuisen, as a DA leader, went to Washington. Almost he may not have been doing it like AfriForum did it, where they make wild claims and all of that. But that was not an honest mission that the DA had gone to the US with. So it's going to be interesting to see what it is that his input is going to be this time around. We know citrus is one of our biggest exports to the US. We know that that's likely to be affected by the tariffs when they happen. So those kinds of conversations, or at least the content of the conversation is going to be the most interesting part.
Yeah, can we talk as well about the 49 South Africans? I mean, it's been such a big talking point for the past few days in the country that it's almost hard to ignore. And we saw the images at the beginning of this week of these 49 South Africans arriving in the US. You had, of course, the officials speaking to them and, talking about how they understand that they have faced so many troubles and challenges in South Africa, and that this is the land where they're going to be able to I suppose, find some safety. How does the president tackle that?
Again,
and certainly what the optics are when you're sitting in the Oval Office or in Washington, D.C., and you're confronted with, we've taken your most vulnerable.
Sure. Again, even on Sunday, after the images of seeing them getting into, or at least in queues at the airport, and a few days later when they were now in the US, being admitted as American citizens, or at least being part of being processed, right? The presidency has been very careful in how it communicates and at least crafts all of its statements around this issue. Every interview where President Cyril Ramaphosa was door-stopped, he had been very careful in terms of how he, almost frames the issue, right? Where he could have easily just said, and again, allow me, Naledi, if we were to look at the choice of candidate in John Steenhuisen, any political journalist in South Africa knows that by far the chairperson of the ANC, Gwede Mantashe, is one of the best, at least negotiators in the ANC, right? He's a cabinet minister. He could have taken him to Washington. But the president chose not to take him. It is because just recently, Minister Mantashe said that, listen, we must do a tit for tat. Because these ones need our minerals, if they decide to raise the tariffs, we will not give them the minerals, right? So you can see that there's this strategic choices in not only the words, but the people that are going to, be representing South Africa. And even in this case with the 49, as they are called now, Americandas, right? The biggest thing is going to be on how he responds, how the President Ramaphosa responds to it. It's really going to be how do I make sure that I do not aggravate where we are now? Because he could easily state facts. One, these people are not persecuted in South Africa. Two, they don't actually deserve an asylum status based on, if you're just looking at the law, international law as it were. But he knows that put facts to President Trump, and you know that you're going to be called fake news, you're going to be called all sorts of names. And that's when the degeneration is going to start. So I think he's going to be a lot more careful in how he uses the words, not to make President Trump feel like he's being patronized.
Yeah, sure. It's quite a week ahead of us. We're going to just talk a little bit more about some of the other big stories of the week on the other side of this. But I want to quickly take a look at some of the messages that have come in from our viewers on the past 7 days. Certainly in the week that's coming, this Wednesday, the President of the US set to meet with the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Sanjay Lachman says it's sad. After 8 years of wastage, expenditure of taxpayers' money, NPA sets a rapist free and deports him back to his country. They should do the same with the foreign national taking place in all prisons while feeding with taxpayers' money. Send them back to their countries so we can accommodate our own people. Sanjay, we appreciate the text. SJ says, what stood out for me is the withdrawal of the appointment of CETA's board members after the EFF MP Lonzi exposed corruption and nepotism. SJ, appreciate that. Thank you so much. Anonymous says the story that stood out for me is that of televangelist Timothy Motosho. The concern is why the NPA didn't intervene from the start to prosecute him for his wrongdoings. Our country is too soft when it comes to immigration laws. Look at what's happening at Beitbridge. Foreigners come and go as they like. South Africa needs to be brutal with its restrictions and laws of immigration to avoid the saga of Timothy. Anonymous, appreciate that. Let's take a look at one more. Luvuyo in the Eastern Cape says, good evening, Naledi. The president must be bold and stand for South Africans. He must tell the Americans there is no genocide in this country. Those who left don't want to accept change. All right, we continue with Lorato on the other side of this short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We continue to take a look at the week's top stories. We're in studio with Lorato Tshenkengg, social commentator, and taking your comments via WhatsApp on 072-110-5584 or give us a call, 010-594-6010 as we reflect on the week that was, and then really hard to ignore the week that is coming as well with the upcoming visit of President Cyril Ramaphosa to Washington. But let's look at other stories. Timothy Motosho, today leaving South Africa, heading for Nigeria. As we reflect on certainly how our authorities have dealt with Timothy Motosho, there's been a lot that's been said. I mean, you had civil society organizations and Chapter 9 institutions saying, well, we need to do something about this. The CRL Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission, for instance, as well as the Commission for Gender Equality. What is the biggest lesson that we take from the saga of Timothy Motosho over the years, but certainly over the past few months?
When President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped into office in 2018, there were two keywords that he was using: reform and rebuild, right? And we've seen some reform in certain areas. The rebuild was really based on the fact that there were a number of state institutions that, at least in what they term the 9 wasted years, were being hollowed out. The NPA was one of those. Of course, the appointment of Shamila Batohi was meant to be the beginning of the rebuilding, right? Ask any South African now, right? I can tell you, even, betting my last few rants, that the likelihood is that they are going to believe that the NPA, even with a new boss, it has become the worst of, even if you were to compare it to the so-called 9 wasted years. And this has been as a result, Naledi, of a number of, public, high public profile cases where you recognize that, people get away with technicalities. And of course, law and issue things legal. There's always, an attempt to use, technical means to get away from, being prosecuted, or at least, get the least amount of sentencing if you are found guilty, right? And again, when Omotoso was then sought to be, not found guilty, and as a result of the NPA's process, as a result of the NPA not, doing their job well, it continues again on this thing around we are now seeing an NPA that, one, does not care about maintaining public trust, because you and I and every other South Africans, we're going to believe in the strength of the justice system based on the NPA, because although there are a number of, call it institutions that are in this value chain, you talk about the Hawks, you talk about, SIU and many others, but the NPA at the end of the day
needs to take that evidence.
If they don't work the evidence well, prepare well for the cases, and ensure that they have the best men on the job to ensure that they're able to argue the case successfully, we are then going to be here. And it's truly sad that we are here, considering that you have victims that were were molested and have cases that they would still want to put it up to Omotoso. And now that he's leaving, you started with the story about Home Affairs putting out a statement that he's now been declared somebody who is should only apply after 5 years to be able to come to South Africa. What does it mean about the case that the NPA had said that they will go back, they want to go back to court? What about these victims?
Yeah, then there's the story of little Cwecwe.
Yeah.
And I immediately think of the protests that we saw across the country,
Sure,
asking for justice for Cwecwe. And then we get the news that the National Prosecuting Authority has decided not to pursue prosecution into the rape of the 7-year-old.
And again, right, when you watch that video by Advocate Mthunzi Maga, you can tell that he carefully selects his words to ensure that, one, he does not make it sound as if they were ill-prepared or they are unprepared for this case. But to a certain extent, if you listen carefully, you then realize that there may be, again, a technicality that this case is not going to be prosecutable, right? I guess the bad part of it is that they are not telling us all the facts. It would be interesting to say, what are these issues that you are raising as the NPA to say you will not be able to successfully prosecute this case, or at least even put it before a judge? And what that does is that it takes away, the confidence that we should be having in the system. But importantly as well, that, Naledi, think about something as, it's supposed to be simple, right? But it's one of the most complicated things in the justice system, bail. You'll have somebody who would have stolen, just pilfered a chocolate at a shop. He then gets 500 rands bail. Another is supposed to then be getting about 10,000 rands, or is supposed to pay 10,000 rands bail. You recognize that as South Africans, we don't even understand how this bail thing works, because all the time it's a thing that we chat about, or at least there's constant chatter. Similarly here, it's going to be there to say, how is it that when one, to your point, there were many civil society organizations that had raised an ire, kicked up dust. Surely this kid did not lie. We may not want to believe her, we may not want to believe Cwecwe, but surely there should be something that is done to, attain justice for her. But are we Is there something that we are missing? I suspect there is. But that the NPA is not then telling us the whole truth. What does it do for that confidence in the institution?
Yeah, I mean, you've already got civil society organizations, raising their ire, and I think that's almost a gentle word to use, but taking up the issue and slamming the National Prosecuting Authority over an issue that we'd been watching so closely. Yeah. As a country. Let's talk about this. Of course, we actually touched on this with one of our viewers who sent in the WhatsApp. You've got the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Nobuhle Ngabane, having withdrawn the appointments of chairpersons for SETA boards. This is as there were claims of nepotism, corruption, and the matter actually brought forward by the EFF.
Yeah, the EFF is well known for being, call them rabble-rousers in Parliament, right? That is their brand of politics, right? And again, we saw last week in Parliament, Sihle Lonzi, a member of Parliament in the EFF, raising an issue around the appointment of, or at least at the time, at the beginning of the questions, or at least what is in the public domain, was around the Minister Gwede Mantashe's son, who was said to have been appointed as the chairperson to one of the boards. And again, the theme of our tonight's conversation has really been around the optics and, communications, right? When you are a minister of a government of national unity, the president says that one of the things that is big here is accountability. One of the big things that we want to do is that we want to, turn the tide, and we want to come across as people who, make decisions that demonstrate that we are not a corrupt government.
Yes.
And you then go to the likelihood is that Minister Mantashe's son, there's absolutely nothing wrong with him. It may be that he's actually fit for that position. I don't know his credentials. But the point that I'm making is that when you are Minister Ngabane and you're looking at that name, right, you also are looking at the former advisor of the advisor of Minister Mantashe, right? And you used to work with Minister Mantashe yourself. The question you should have asked is to say, what are the communication implications of this decision that I'm about to ratify, that is going to be in the public domain, that is going to have public scrutiny? And I think in that instance, she completely failed to consider that there will be public outrage and how you then deal with this public outrage. That there's a new process now to, look at an independent panel. The process is soiled, Naledi, at least in the eye of South Africans. Should Minister Mantashe's son come back in the right way, taken in by the independent panel? Unfortunately, it is going to be very difficult to believe that it was independent.
Lorato, an absolute pleasure having you in studio. Thank you so much. And a lot to reflect on. The next 7 days also going to be incredibly interesting in South Africa. Lorato Tshenkengg is a social commentator. Well, you're still watching Newzroom PM, the late edition. More news on the other side of this. Stay with us.